welcome everybody to this Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations CTPSR webinar. Very pleased today to have Sukanya Podder, and I hope I pronounced your name correctly there, to speak about her book, Peacebuilding Legacy, and to have David Curran from the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations to introduce Sukanya and talk with her and then chair the Q&A session. So we will start with the conversation with David and Sukanya, and then there will be time for audience members to put questions either in the chat or to raise their hand. So David, I'll hand it over to you to do the introduction.
Great, thank you, Gwyneth. Hello, everyone. To introduce Sukanya, Sukanya Podder is a reader in post-war reconstruction and peace building at King's College London. Before joining the Defence Studies Department, Sukanya was a lecturer in International Security and Development at the Centre for International Security and Resilience at Cranfield University. And Sukanya teaches on topics such as defence engagement, security sector reform, international interventions for peace and state building, and regional security. I have had the privilege of working with Sukanya on a previous project on approaches to civilian protection. And Sukanya has taken this work forward as well with a recent project under the Safer Spaces Network. I think some of us here in the room are on the Safer Spaces Network. Sukanya's project is entitled Unarmed Civilian Protection Through Collective Impact, Learning from the JOS Stakeholders Centre for Peace for Enhanced Civilian Protection in Maiduguri, northeastern Nigeria. Although that isn't a topic for the discussion, I'm sure Sukanya will be happy to talk about it as well in the Q&A. But we're here to speak about Sukanya's book, which has been published with Oxford University Press, and it's called Peacebuilding Legacy. And this analyses the long-term effects of peacebuilding programs involving children and young people. It unpacks the concept of peacebuilding legacy through the lens of time, transformation, and intergenerational peace. It also develops a unique qualitative cues for measuring legacy in terms of institutional, normative, and organisational logics. And the book is guided by a key research question, which is how can technocratic approaches to peacebuilding that are rooted in short-term project-based execution of activities further the long-term transformative outcomes, like altering young people's attitudes and beliefs about peace and violence. In terms of format, for this conversation, we're looking at about 25 to 30 minutes of guided conversation before an open question and answer. And Sukanya and myself have considered a way in which to approach this seminar to break it up a bit and focus on the discussion on both of the outcomes of the book and the way the ideas came together. So Sukanya, welcome to CTPSR virtually, and congratulations on the book again. It's also in our library. We've made sure of that. So Lisa Lawrence has been on the case. So to start, Sukanya, if you could just talk about maybe the motivations for the book and the project that led to the publication. Great.
Thanks so much, David. It's such a pleasure to speak to an audience and a center that is specifically focused on issues of peace building, on reconciliation and trust. I actually very briefly worked at, it was then differently named, but it was still focused on peace and reconciliation issues. And I think you, as a center, you guys tend to attract a lot of students from overseas who will go back into the field and have a multiplier effect in terms of the real work of peace building. So it's a great privilege. In terms of this book, like many of us who've been working on peace and conflict studies for nearly 2 decades, I think the motivation from the book came from some of the field work I was doing in West Africa in 2007, 2008, decades back. But at that time, I was looking at the issue of child soldiers and their recruitment into the Liberian civil wars. I was also an intern with IOM, the International Organization for Migration, and I was working on their ex-combatant reintegration projects. And one of the things I realized early on, partly through the field work, but also through my interactions with UN agencies, with the UN mission in Liberia, the various child protection agencies, UNICEF, Save the Children, and others, that their understanding of peace building or the requirements in terms of returning ex-combatants into communities was very top down. It had a very sort of externally driven understanding of their needs. And a lot of research and writing has been published on issues of ex-combatant reintegration. But one of the things I looked at was also children and young people who had not taken part in the war, who were part of various projects in terms of peace building and reconciliation. And one of the things that became very apparent to me was this puzzle that none of these organizations, whether they were large UN agencies or international organizations or various local and national implementing organizations, were not really looking back, pausing or thinking about, the effect of their work, or even when they left the country after decades of presence, which is what happens with some of these civil society organizations or international peace building organizations. So there's very little reflection or even, a kind of structured approach to learning from the work that they do over several decades. And that is the main motivation for writing this book.
So with that motivation in mind, how did you, I suppose the next step is, how did you go about your data collection and the methodologies and the approaches?
And this is a very candid conversation. So as many of us researchers seek funding from time to time, at one point around 2014, I was writing a grant application, and that the focus was on trying to understand the methodological issues. How do we go about measuring the long-term effects of peace building? And at that point, it was purely trying to create a methodological framework for looking back and reflecting on the work of peace building organizations. And I reached out to Search for Common Ground, well-known international peace building organization, which has a dedicated children and youth program section. And I was working with their director, and we were focusing on methodological issues. Eventually, the funding did not come through, but that relationship, in terms of the interaction, deepened, and I was able to get access to their evaluative data over 10, 15 years, because some of these children youth focus programs were running over decades. And we focused on two countries. The first was in Sierra Leone, where it was, the focus was on intergenerational tensions and community radio, particularly peace media. And another case study was from the Balkans, because one was sunsetting in Sierra Leone, and in the Balkans, the North Macedonia case was, almost wrapping up. So we had a lot of longitudinal data to look at in terms of peace education. There the focus was on kindergartens and on intergroup cohesion and issues of intercultural communication through these preschool interventions. So these were the two cases we focused on, and the choice of cases was largely based on the availability of longitudinal data, evaluative data. So this actually was, I almost stumbled upon the opportunity to use this kind of rare longitudinal data to look at long-term effects of peace building projects.
And with that in mind, so you engaged in your data, were those your two main points of data collection in the Balkans and Sierra Leone itself?
No, David, sorry, I didn't quite follow properly. So there were several levels. So obviously the first was this institutional access, which was,
I see, so.
In terms of getting access to the evaluative data, which I used a meta-ethnographic synthesis approach. It's quite common in health, healthcare research, in nursing and other areas, but we don't quite apply it that much in peace and conflict studies. I found that really helpful. It's very time consuming, but as an approach, it can help you look at long-term data and kind of analyze the themes and the framework. And what you do is you do secondary synthesis. So you look at the findings from the evaluative data, and then you look at the links, because you can see that in a particular country, the different projects, what is getting funded, what the donor initiatives are, what the donor themes are. and that was very helpful. But I followed it up with field work, in-person field work in both countries, and also further follow-up research with various evaluators, with various program managers. So it was in close cooperation with the country offices or country teams. Okay.
And what were your key findings from there's a small question with a big answer. I suppose your key findings in both countries, but individually in Sierra Leone and in North Macedonia.
So in terms of findings, there are several levels to it, obviously. But the first was, what types of programs, and one of the things I was looking at in terms of legacy was handover and succession. So very rarely do these organizations who are doing long-term work in a particular country tend to hand over or have a structured exit strategy, which involves handing over the learning and even certain models of peace building, which actually work very well, to national organizations, whether these are successor organizations, named successor organizations, or whether they are government departments. So that was one of the areas that I was looking at in terms of institutionalization and timely exits. I was also looking at norm transmission and norm retention. So there's this huge volume of work, and many of your colleagues might be using peace norms and some of the normative elements in their work. But very few studies actually look at whether the question of resonance, the kind of norms and values that have been transmitted by various peace building projects, whether the fact that they resonate, kind of align with the pre-existing values and pre-existing belief systems in a particular society. Often they don't. And when they don't, when there is weak resonance, invariably the retention or the continuity in terms of continuing to apply some of these values around elections or democracy or women's rights, participation, may or may not follow through. And particularly in the Balkan case study, we saw that this entire idea of intergroup cohesion through contact programs, through intercultural communication, did not take off because there was very weak resonance with the reality of intergroup cleavages and differences. So norm resonance and retention was the other thing. And then, of course, institutional learning and reflection, how different country offices were responding to the evaluative data. Were they willing to make shifts, or changes to their theory of change in certain projects? Often peace building is about the showing of doing, rather than actually sitting down and trying to adjust projects in a way that they speak to local needs, local requirements in terms of values, in terms of implementation. I think that was also one of the important things. In terms of overall findings, with the institutionalization element, I found that education programs are actually easier to institutionalize and hand over compared to media programs where, kind of gauging the long-term effects they're quite dispersed. It's very difficult to gauge the long-term effects. And even when there are success organizations, often it was in the form of community radio, and there was weak linkages in terms of continuity. So peace media, I found, was a difficult one in terms of institutionalization. And in terms of learning and reflection, one of the things is staff continuity, learning behaviors, very simple learning behaviors. In some of these countries, it's difficult to implement high-tech or resource intensive methods, but simple things like maintaining notebooks or being able to have meetings where you record the learning from the lowest level in terms of the field staff to the country office programs and the more head office coordinators. I think that is really important. So it's almost a habit beyond donor demands of M&E, monitoring and evaluation. Every donor will insist on monitoring and evaluation as an accountability mechanism. But learning and reflection needs to be second nature to institutions or organizations who are implementing peace building work, whether these are really, tiny, low capacity, often under-resourced local organizations, or whether they are larger international peacebuilding organizations.
And this was the case in both Sierra Leone and the Balkans. Did you find any notable differences?
Yeah, the main difference actually was in terms of staff continuity. So in the Balkans, in the North Macedonia case, because the same team had continued to run the peace education project for over 2 decades, there was continuity in terms of the themes that were being dealt with. In Sierra Leone, much bigger program, much more dispersed in terms of attention, which meant that they were doing different kinds of projects and often chasing donor funds. And when they were chasing donor funds, what was happening is they lost thread in terms of the continuity of certain programs, which are actually quite successful. So there was not enough follow-up, not enough continuing to do programming in the same area to have better effect or long-term effects. So one of the things was definitely about staff continuity and the willingness to, sort of keep doing work in a concentrated kind of way over several years in a particular theme.
Broadening this out to the field and the theory, because I suppose that's part of our job. Where do you think where do you think the current field is at after undertaking your research and publishing your book, and then I suppose as a follow-on, what implications does your book have? Again, very small questions with very big answers, I suppose.
David, actually, and I find this such a collegiate environment in terms of so many peace and conflict researchers. I think we all need to collectively think about the issue of temporality a bit. And Roger McGinty has been writing a bit about temporality. There are a few other international relations scholars who are looking at temporality, but I think we don't sufficiently understand or value the fact that over time conflicts change. And at various points in time, there are peace building initiatives or ceasefires or mediation efforts, let's say various injections of peace within a conflict ecosystem. And when that happens, the experiences of conflict and peace kind of changes almost generationally. And let's think about some of these long duration conflicts. You have various colleagues who are working in Palestine, for example, Kashmir or Afghanistan or South Sudan. Think about these long duration conflicts, these unfinished conflicts, where different generations have met different experiences of conflict and peace, but also they have different expectations and different needs from the efforts at building peace or conflict resolution or mediation. And I don't think we are sufficiently understanding this intergenerational element. And this book talks a little bit about intergenerational peace, but potentially it is an area that I will expand on and do more work in the future.
Right. And would you like to, I suppose, is that a bit of a forerunner to discuss intergenerational peace as the concept that you've?
David, I think intergenerational peace, what I mean is that we need to apply a generational lens to peace building. That the older generation and their experiences of conflict and expectations from peace building, for example, veterans in South Sudan, we had this Ministry of Veteran Affairs, and they had a certain, in terms of their expectations of being heroes from the war, of making sacrifices in terms of the guerrilla war and the liberation movement. And their expectations from the peace was that they should be commemorated and rewarded and get a pension and things like that. And then the younger generation and its expectations from state building, or how the state should provide services or create new opportunities, whether it's education, healthcare. And often these are really big asks for a state like South Sudan. What I'm trying to say is that with an intergenerational peace lens, we can understand not only issues of memory, issues of spatiality, in terms of territory, space, events, how these are remembered, how these are included in curricula. This is an entirely different project, which is probably taking birth now. But I think I'm getting quite excited about doing more conceptual and empirical work with the intergenerational peace lens.
Fantastic. And I suppose on a policy front, because you've worked a lot with policymakers and practitioners, should I say, in the development of the book, has the kind of, there are recommendations or thoughts towards a practitioner community, I guess, in a book such as this that's so heavily embedded?
Yes, and one of the positives was this co-production element, the fact that I worked with a large international peacebuilding organization as a first port of call. The findings from the 2 country offices could be disseminated to their learning and reflection. They have an entire apparatus in terms of learning from their projects. So that was very helpful to be able to feed into their processes of institutional learning. But obviously there are broader findings from the book about how different organizations, whether these are local peacebuilding organizations or larger organizations or even the UN, can engage in terms of institutional learning approaches, in terms of better codifying memory around the different projects, whether that's really kind of creating a more structured approach to codifying and creating databases and creating documentation, including staff memory, including handover and memos and emails. All of these can be such a rich and often overlooked source of learning. And then, of course, from the norm, transmission, resonance, and retention perspective, I think just overall in terms of the kind of projects that are being pursued or invested in, or the type of structures, in terms of handover and succession, the type of structures that peacebuilding organizations can work with, and how better to negotiate this question of exit, because it can get quite difficult towards the end when it's time to exit and you need to move on to Ukraine because that's where the funds are, or the next hotspot, instead of really taking stock of the work that has been done for decades in a particular country. And creating the linkages so that that learning and the benefits of doing peacebuilding work for so many years is not lost.
Right, that's really fascinating. I suppose I do have a question, and I'm soon going to open it out to the floor. It's very different. It's really interesting seeing that difference between monitoring and evaluation for the sake of monitoring and evaluation, and monitoring and evaluation for the sake of learning, and organizations learning about the impact that their work is having and the long-term legacy of the work they're having. And that divide, is that a divide that can't be bridged, or is that just do the organizations try and meet both of those aims? Or
from an instrumental perspective, from a practical or pragmatic perspective, it's almost invariably what is being funded, and what is being funded, if you're highly dependent on donor funds, if their overheads are not being covered by certain grants, there's not enough constant input of finances and funding in a way that you can sustain an institutional structure for learning and reflection. What happens is invariably you do the minimum that you have to in terms of monitoring and evaluation, minimum in the sense that it's linked to the project, and it is a showing of doing and a performance-based activity and an accountability-based activity. But in terms of legacy, I think it's important, and I speak to this in the book, about follow-up research, about follow-up with participants, beneficiaries, with communities, and actually creating a pot of money institutionally to be able to do this. Several organizations now, the Swedish organization, several others that I cite, who are now investing in what is called post-exit or kind of studies to evaluate the long-term effects of this work. There's one example from Sri Lanka where we've had this happen. But overall, I think that it's more of a organizational commitment to learning, which we need to encourage, rather than linking it to donor-focused evaluative activity. And one of the projects, which is now almost nearly written up, is with Gerard Miller at Aberdeen. We have been for several years working and writing around the issue of Indigenous monitoring and evaluation. And hopefully we are able to then advise as to what are these self-sustaining ways in which communities, locals can continue to monitor and evaluate the changes that they see once various peacebuilding projects and programs have closed, and they have the tools themselves to continue observing change and being able to reflect on and learn from the change that they observe. So watch that space.
That's very interesting. And I suppose my final question was going to be, where does this take you next? And well, you might have already answered it.
Hopefully, David, a very exciting project on intergenerational peace, and hopefully some funding to take that project in the direction that I want to. So that's my aspiration. There's no funder in here, but if there were, I would say, please give me some money to do this next project. Thanks so much. It's been so much fun talking to you.
No worries. So thank you for being so open and candid with your answers.